y'all ever listened to the Serge Gainsbourg album Cannabis?
I don't think I have. I don't even know if I knew of that.
From the film Cannabis. It's actually the music for the film.
Oh, no.
I can't say that I have.
think I've even heard of that.
Okay, I'll send the track along before I have the final edit, and you can tell me if you like it for the intro music. But so we're joined by Keanu Heydari and Mason Mennenga. Keanu and Mason, would you like to introduce yourselves?
Go ahead, Keanu.
Oh, well, my name is Keanu Heydari. I study 19th and 20th century history. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and I have interests in New Testament studies and apocalyptic as a framework for understanding the New Testament.
And what is your background again, Keanu? Can you just tell us like what kind of, how were you raised? What tradition do you come from? Where you find yourself today?
I was raised in a pretty secular context, but currently I'm a member of the Episcopal Church in the United States, and I'm doing research in Paris right now. So I attend the American Cathedral in Paris.
Ooh, fancy. Yeah. Thank you, by the way. You actually pronounced my last name right. A lot of times when I'm going on podcasts, people don't say my last name right, which is fine.
It's pretty simple. You just read it. It's Mennenga. It's obvious.
I know. It feels like the most simple last name, but people manage a way to screw it up. So congrats on you for knowing how to pronounce it. Anyway, I am a podcaster, and I'm also a Master of Arts student. I go to United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities, and I'm currently writing my thesis. In fact, just about an hour ago before I had lunch, I was doing some final touch-ups with my thesis. So I'm getting really close to the end, which I'm excited about. But before that, I got a Master of Divinity at Christian Theological Seminary in Indianapolis. And in terms of traditions, I grew up very conservative evangelical in the Midwest. So small town Midwest, growing up in all of that. And then when I was in college, my faith really changed quite a bit. I really got involved in the emergent church movement, which at that point was sort of at its tail end, but got involved with this church in the Twin Cities, and was a youth pastor there for a little while I was going to seminary, and I'm still part of that church. And now I work at United Theological Seminary, which I guess is a UCC seminary, but I really don't identify myself with the UCC.
I see. So for myself, I grew up also in the American Midwest, and I was growing up in the holiness branch of evangelicalism, which is kind of like your older brother to the Pentecostals, so to speak.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I found myself basically ejected from that world when I finished high school. So I went to Christian high school and all these things. And then there was this big issue in my family, and I was just kind of, the police showed up and said, "Son, you can't stay here." And I say, "Well, I live here." And they're like, "You're 18, get out."
Get out.
And so I got out, and it took me a long time to kind of make sense of that. And, today I have become an Orthodox Christian, and I was really interested to talk to both Mason and Keanu about this question of deconstruction, because like Keanu, I've spent some time in France, and, I remember going to French university where Derrida and all these things were just kind of assumed that you'd already read and known and understood. And then I was, getting on social media during the COVID lockdowns and seeing all of these evangelicals back in America talking about deconstruction. I'm like, well, what is this? What are they doing? Are they getting really into Derrida? What is going on? And I started listening to their stories, and I saw a lot of things that I could relate with, people questioning their faith or feeling like they were growing up in an abusive or harmful situation. And the most bizarre thing to me personally was seeing, figures I'd known, like the I Kiss Dating Goodbye guy, coming out and selling like courses on how you can deconstruct and things like this. And so I thought it might be interesting because Mason is sort of a Twitter provocateur who denied to me that he was an ex-evangelical. So we can get to that in a minute. But
yeah,
I just don't know. Like, do you all feel like you deconstructed? For me, I don't think I guess I did, in the sense that I, rethought my beliefs and changed my tradition, but I don't know if that counts as deconstruction really. How do you all relate? I know, Keanu, you're not even really evangelical to begin with, right? You don't have any grounding in that world.
Well, actually, I began my story as a Reformed Baptist. And so
Oh.
I remember when I was in high school, one of my projects was to interview someone and ask them about their life experience. And this is a little bit after I had a major health crisis in the beginning of my high school experience. I remember interviewing a pastor, and I asked him straightforwardly, do you consider yourself a fundamentalist? And he said, yes, I do. And I asked him to explain what he meant. And he said something along the lines of, well, we're getting back to the fundamentals of the tradition. We're getting back to the basics of Christianity, what people in the early church believed. And now, I don't know, maybe a decade after the fact, I think to myself, was what that church, what they subscribed to, was that actually the fundamental expression of the beliefs of the first century church? And I'm not so sure anymore.
Mm.
So in that way, I suppose you could say I have deconstructed. I do want to add, I spoke to my friend Madison earlier, and he gave me some advice about the podcast. And he asked me to ask the question, does deconstruction actually refer to a deconstruction of theological beliefs, or is it more dissociating yourself from certain social milieu where one finds oneself? And so I've been thinking about that for some time now, about are we deconstructing ourselves if we do go ahead and call what we're doing deconstruction? Is it one of theology, or is it one of social milieus, or is it both? But yeah.
What do you make of that, Mason?
Yeah, I do think it probably is both, at least from my experience and knowing people that do use that term deconstruction. That's not something that I've really ever described my own journey with, but what I've noticed, at least for a lot of people, is they have kind of these moments early on in quote unquote deconstruction where they start to examine their beliefs, whether it's about hell or homosexuality or whatever it might be. And in that examining, they start to realize, okay, maybe all that I've been told about Christianity and my faith growing up isn't actually all that true, or that there are different ways of thinking about this that I didn't know about. And so as people start to go on that journey and that trajectory, that's when they start to kind of disassociate, at least from my experience, to the point that some end up leaving Christianity altogether, maybe become atheists, whatever it might be. Maybe some just like move from being evangelical to being Episcopalian or whatever it might be. But there tends to be both happening, that they do examine their beliefs, they are interrogating what they've been brought up theologically, and then eventually disassociate from that community altogether.
And I guess one of the reasons why I wanted to have Keanu on here is because I know he spent quite a bit of time going through these sort of critical theory source material. And I was wondering, do you see any link, Keanu, between this sort of sociological phenomena of evangelical deconstruction? Is there any line to that through to Heidegger and destruction, or is there no really connection as far as you can tell? I mean, I guess we could say that like anything could be a text, so anything could be deconstructed, but I don't know if that's really helpful as an analytical tool.
I definitely see parallels between what some evangelicals are doing when they say that they're doing deconstruction. For me, when I think about the critical theoretical apparatus of deconstruction, I immediately go to some of Derrida's most famous remarks in Of Grammatology and other important texts. Basically, it just comes down to the fundamental idea that there is a sign and there's a signifier, or thing signified. And meaning is not out there waiting to be discovered. Rather, meaning is identified by the space between the words of, so if you will, the space between words, the black font on a page, the between the ligatures, the empty white space of the page is where meaning is to be found. So if I say the word cat to you, cat isn't signified by the furry feline creature. It's really given meat, if you will, by its reference to the word dog, with its reference to the word fur, or four-legged animal, or mammal. We have a symbolic repertoire of images in our head with which we can understand language. Deconstruction is about highlighting the perhaps you could say artificially constructed binaries that exist in any language system, and subverting them, pointing them out, pointing out the fact that without reference to the concept of lowness, you can't really have the concept of highness, or without the concept of light, you can't have dark. And pointing out these binaries and making them self-evident, making them more evident to the reader, is one key tool of deconstruction. Now, how that relates to what evangelicals are doing, I think perhaps one lineage, and again, I haven't done enough historical study of this to say whether there's a definitive linkage in terms of the average person on the street who's deconstructing their faith. But I would say the pointing out binaries, you could call them artificial binaries between ideas like heaven and hell, as articulated in traditional fundamentalist doctrine. What I think returning to a more scholarly understanding of what people in the first century actually believed, going to someone like N.T. Wright or his arch nemesis David Bentley Hart, both of them are doing a project of deconstruction in one way, which is to say that the cultural world of the first century sincerely did not look like, theologically, the landscape we find ourselves in today. And whether that means returning to these doctrines of the first century via a move to a more mainline denomination, or a return to the Catholic Church or to Eastern Orthodoxy, or leaving to become a more secular atheist person, I think either of those moves shows a quote-unquote deconstruction of binaries, if you will.
I'm not so sure. And I guess my confusion on this point comes from spending a lot of time recently listening to people, whether it's on a podcast, on YouTube, reading what they've written, engaging with people on Twitter, opening up, trying to open up as many different accounts of deconstruction as it's used in the faith context as possible to understand what do people mean by it. And in a lot of cases, I don't know if I can say the majority of cases, but in a lot of cases, it seems like rather than do what you just described, Keanu, what happens is the binary or the overall frame remains in place. And we simply, we do the I was fundamentalist and now I'm an amazing atheist. Or my evangelical church told me that hell, if I dug down to the center of the earth, I would fall in there. And now I believe that hell is just like mythological language, right? So you accept the kind of fundamentalist worldview about there being like the liberal Christians and the real Christians. You don't actually challenge the frame. You just switch sides. And part of me wants to ask if it's not a political thing ultimately, where we can see like in the last presidential election that sort of fragment of the American, quote unquote middle class that was traditionally voting Republican flipped for Biden. So now as the suburbs go for the Democrats, so too suburban religion, which is often, white evangelicalism, takes on a new hue. It takes on this more, it inverts itself. So I'm not sure if there's really a deconstruction or if there's just a kind of a flipping. What do you make of this, Mason?
I mean, again, it's hard to pinpoint exactly like how much influence like Derridian deconstruction actually is playing in this like faith context of deconstruction. It's really hard like to pinpoint what exactly is going on there. I will say though that insofar that one is kind of interrogating this like binary system of thinking, and if we're calling that deconstruction, again, I think Derrida's understanding of it was much more robust than that. But if we do understand that as deconstruction, I do think that in general is happening among these people who are leaving evangelicalism or jaded by evangelicalism. I do think that is happening, where they are, because so much of that world is the evangelical world is predicated on binary thinking, that there is good and evil, there's straight and homosexual, heaven and hell, and you're having to live through that world. And so I do think there is like a re-examination there for a lot of folks as they go through that journey. And again, like some end up settling on going into like the Episcopal world, where so much of that binary thinking isn't exactly as forefront. or they might leave evangelicalism and leave Christianity and become an atheist. And maybe there's less of that binary thinking there, although I think that's not necessarily the case, especially in the new atheist world. So, yeah, I think something like that is happening, but it certainly is not exactly what Derrida would have conceived of when thinking about deconstruction. I mean, there's not a chance that he would have thought that this is how that word would have been used, I'm guessing.
I'm interested that you brought up at the beginning, Mason, about the emergent church. And I was talking to kind of an old head who was telling me that
Who is
he
that?
thinks Reverend Tim Kahlo from
I don't know if
United
I know that
Methodist
person.
Church. He's a good guy on social media you can follow. But he was basically saying that he sees the deconstruction, not entirely, but he sees a lot of parallels with the emergent church.
Oh my God, yes. Yeah.
And I've participated in some of these like deconstruction coffee hours that people do, where I think people might be kind of comfortable with being deconstructing, not necessarily as a process, but also just as like a placeholder or a position of being like, I was evangelical, now I'm deconstructing. And it's like a place that you can be, you can inhabit, right? And I'm wondering to what degree, given that you participated in the emerging church, do you see a difference, a contrast, a continuity?
Yeah. I definitely
and maybe
see...
also speak really quick about what the emergent church was, because I don't think we described that.
Yeah. So the emergent church was this movement of Christianity, mostly Christianity, I would imagine, of kind of rethinking like what Christianity ought to look like in kind of a postmodern context. I mean, this would have been the late 1990s to early 2000s, right? So kind of that like postmodern turn where you start, postmodern art starts popping up. And so anyway, the conversation around postmodernism was really dominant. And basically the emergent church was the Christian kind of framework to think about like what faith in the Christian faith ought to look like in the postmodern world. So anyway, that's kind of what the emergent church would have been. I mean, if people know who like Rob Bell is, Brian McLaren.
Rob Bell, Brian McLaren, Mark Driscoll, these would all be kind of...
Yeah, they would all kind of been in that world of like rethinking, like what does Christianity ought to look like in this postmodern context. So the similarities, I do think there are a lot of similarities. I mean, it's kind of interesting that like a lot of emergent church leaders actually knew Derrida. Pete Rollins definitely was doing a lot of work, not only scholarship with Derrida, but I'm pretty sure he like met Derrida a number of times. Actually, the pastor of my church, or used to be the pastor of my church at Solomon's Porch here in Minneapolis, he had like a emergent church conference that invited Derrida, and so he saw Derrida speak and interacted with him quite a bit. And so there was like a actual like Derridian presence within that emergent church. I mean, a lot of those people were familiar with Derrida, to a certain extent, familiar with his philosophy. So he had some level of influence in that world. And so the conversation around deconstruction in the emergent church was certainly happening. And a lot of it was a lot of people coming from like conservative evangelicalism, examining their faith, and eventually moving into a quote unquote more like liberal Christianity.
And what happened? Why did it disappear?
A lot of it is just like Rob Bell he just kind of moved on to doing different things. That's a really good question.
He was kind of pushed out, though. Let's be explicit. He was made very unwelcome.
Yeah, I mean, love went not by the emergent leaders for the most part, but by like Christianity in general.
Yeah, by like broader evangelicalism.
Right. Yeah, totally.
But then he kind of found himself with Oprah or whatever. He kind of became like a self-help guru, if I understand.
Right. Yeah. So I think he just kind of like mostly left Christianity altogether for the most part. And so like he kind of went on to do his own thing. Brian McLaren kind of went on to do his own thing. He's doing a lot of like political organizing work, as well as a former pastor of my church ended up leaving his pastorate to do political organizing work. And so, yeah, I think a lot of them just kind of went their ways. There was a lot of controversy going on, not just from like evangelicals criticizing the emergent church, but even within the emergent church itself, there was some feuds going on, just some controversy, and eventually just kind of fizzled away. So, but with that said, a lot of people who were a part of the emergent church were people coming from like conservative evangelicalism, reimagining their faith, and over that time would have probably landed in like a progressive Christianity or liberal Christianity.
Would you consider Shane Claiborne to be part of that movement?
He definitely was involved as a interlocutor, probably not. But he definitely was involved. He was definitely somebody that people were reading and had some level of influence. But I would really identify someone like Rob Bell, Peter Rollins, Doug Padgett, and Brian McLaren as kind of like really interlocutors there. Maybe even like Nadia Boltz-Weber would be another person to throw.
And how do you feel about the deconstruction vis-a-vis the emergent?
I do think they had probably a better grasp of what at least Derrida meant by it. Again, like a lot of those folks were influenced by Derrida. They were actually reading scholars of Derrida, if not reading Derrida himself. And so I do think there was like a level of that. What I think happened that like made a turn here to what, you know, all the conversation around deconstruction is now that is different than what was happening before was, you know, like Peter Rollins was obviously talking a little bit about deconstruction, but in a different way. And I think what a lot of people realized was that's the term they're going to use for this journey of their faith or whatever. And it really just became totally disconnected, not only from like Peter Rollins' work and his involvement in the emergent church, but then it was totally disconnected then from Derrida's work. And you just saw it kind of as this term then that started being used as a way to describe that faith journey for a lot of people. And so, yeah, if you ask most people now who are quote unquote like deconstruction influencers, not a chance that if they maybe have read Peter Rollins, they definitely have not read Derrida. And so it is really interesting to see like the emergent church was really involved with like Derrida's work. I think they had a decent grasp of what he meant by that, by deconstruction. But then, yeah, things really started to shift and change as the emergent church movement became less of an influence. But then there still were a number of people leaving evangelicalism, and they were, you know, in communities together, and they were trying to figure out a way, like, how do we describe this thing that we're experiencing? And for whatever reason, deconstruction was that word. And it likely was due to Peter Rollins' influence still at that time on them. So anyway, at least from like my perspective, I could totally be wrong on that. But if
it's interesting.
If I were to give a history of it, that's at least from my perspective, how I would have articulated it.
Yeah, I mean, I was a bit too young at the time of emergent church to really have participated in any meaningful degree. What I recall is that at that time, there was a lot of emphasis on community and about real flesh and blood community.
Yeah.
And what I'm noticing is that there seems to be with deconstruction the opposite emphasis, that it seems to be mostly mediated through technological means. So like right now, we're all talking through a screen, but we're recording a podcast, right? I don't expect Mason or Keanu to walk away from this and like rethink their relationship to God fundamentally, right? You know, that's something that I think in the emergent church was handled in the sense that we need to actually strengthen. That was a critique of evangelicalism, if I remember correctly.
Right, yeah.
That there was a lack of real community. And in the current context, I just don't know that buying a course from some guy that wrote a bad book 20 years ago is really a path to spiritual well-being. I don't know. What do you make of this, Keanu?
I think the modern context of deconstruction, I should say the contemporary context of deconstruction, is sort of moving in a direction of market capitalization. I think once you see this kind of identitarian process of marketing niche Christian experiences to different audiences for profit, you're going to see the corollary or the inverse of evangelicalism manifesting itself in these, I would say, insidious ways. So you mentioned, He Who Shall Not Be Named with his infamous book on dating.
I honestly don't remember his name. I'm happy to call him out, but I don't remember.
Joshua Harris.
Josh Harris. Yes, thank you.
Harris's very problematic book that traumatized the generation of people with the sort of self-help courses that are now being offered, with the sort of books, conferences, devotionals, media market enterprises that are being marketed to people to deconstruct their faith. To me, I'm very cynical about the project. I'm cynical about it because I don't see any institutionality to this. I don't see communitarian organizing. I don't see tangible lines of theological reconstruction coming at the end of the deconstruction process. What I do see is people trying to profit off of the suffering and trauma of other people. And by all means, I don't mean to suggest that this is true for even a majority of individuals who are experiencing the process of growing in their faith, of challenging established dogmas, of challenging, pre-existing institutions. But I do think there is a contingent of people who is doing their best to make a profit off of um, this process of deconstruction.
Yeah, I absolutely agree that it, like, over the last, I would say even 4 years, it feels like it's just happened right before my eyes. But over the last like 4 years, you've seen this market emerge. And not only, as you said, Keanu, that like people are profiting off of it, but also evangelicals are now trying to profit off of this idea of deconstruction. I mean, you're seeing books being written from an evangelical, a conservative perspective about their response to what do we do about these deconstruction people. Like, even that side of things is trying to market off of it. So it's weird how or profit off of it. So it's weird how there's this whole market that's emerged. And it feels like it's only happened in like the last 5 years, especially. That's probably another difference that you don't see exactly with like the emergent church movement. Certainly there were people of influence, there were writers, there were people who were articulating a kind of Christianity that made sense for people leaving evangelicalism. But this like idea of like deconstruction as like a term that you can market around, that's totally new. I mean, maybe within the last 5 years that I've noticed.
Yeah, I feel like in my own, and this might just be my own perspective as somebody that was completely disconnected from social media until about a year ago. It seems to me there's been a lot of pickup around the pandemic. And so
Oh
part of
yeah.
me wonders, so much of religion, of faith, of our traditions comes from our particular location within a family, within a community context. And when that is ripped from us by the conditions of lockdown or borders separating people or whatever it is, their church literally being closed, maybe that's the moment where people start to go online and look around and they see difference. I don't know. I think there's something about the social media as the site of deconstruction that I'm not sure how to make sense of.
This is also part of the reason why I don't identify as an ex-evangelical. I see ex-evangelical as part of that like market that has emerged. And I'm first off, I'm just like not interested in that project. I very much identify as a Christian. I'm interested in constructing a Christian theology. And so I just like don't see myself within that movement. And I'm certainly like not interested in like trying to profit off of this movement of deconstruction and this movement of like ex-evangelicalism. Now,
Because you
granted,
went from like neo Calvinist to process liberation theology, but you don't
yeah,
see
I
that
mean,
as deconstruction.
well, I wouldn't like personally identify that as deconstruction, mostly because like I never really left Christianity. I went from
Right.
like neo-Calvinism and then like immediately was immersed in like kind of quote unquote progressive Christianity, like the Brian McLaren, Rob Bell stuff of the
Yeah.
world. And then when I was in seminary, that's when I really got involved with like process thought, radical theology, and everything. But at no
And
point
because
did I
those
ever
have a
like leave.
positive content, it's not ex-evangelical.
Yeah,
You're
I
not
mean,
defined in opposition to, I don't know,
yeah,
to John Piper or whatever.
yeah, to me, those theologies are creating a constructive theology. And
Mm.
so that is where I'm just like, I'm just not really interested in it. Now, granted, there are people that might follow me that resonate with my experiences of growing up with
Hmm.
conservative evangelicalism and also might be interested in the kind of theology I'm interested in imagining. But I myself like don't see the thing I'm doing as like a deconstruction project or an ex-evangelical project.
No, but that's also a good point that you sparked in my mind, which is the term evangelical itself has changed meaning in the last 5 years. Where if you follow people online like Ryan Burge and others who do the sort of demographic study, we see an incidence not only of non-Christians, but of people of other religions like Sikhs, Muslims, Jews, etc., calling themselves evangelical because they see it as a socio-political identity of being a certain part of conservatism, basically.
Yeah, I saw a survey a couple months ago around that too, where the people who became more in support of Trump over his presidency, those people ended up identifying more as an evangelical during those 4 years. Like their identification with that label became more prominent over those 4 years. However, those same people, their religiosity actually became less. They were going to church less. They were praying less. They were just participating in their faith less. And so that to me is like a really clear sign, like that evangelical label is even for people who are evangelical, it's changing for them.
Keanu, I know you're in your historical study. Have you ever come across this research about the bourgeois values of like the American ruling class? Are you familiar with this discourse?
To some extent, yeah, absolutely.
The idea that, for example, if you look at sort of culture war discourse and look at how people actually live, like Democratic Party donors, for example, are more likely to be married, more likely to have children, more likely to live in the suburbs, more likely to, live in ways that we would consider to be, goes against the way that people culturally signal, so to speak, right? And I'm wondering to what degree that plays a part in this overall process sociologically. Do you think there's any link between evangelical taking on an explicitly political valence and then this sort of ex-evangelical identity?
I think suffice it to say that there are major sociological implications to what Mason brought up, namely the kind of inverse, you could almost call it a parallax of evangelicals becoming less religious functionally, while identifying with evangelicalism more substantially as a label. So sociologically, I think it's a very interesting phenomenon. As to the whole bourgeois values question. I'm not 100% sure. I think what comes to mind is a couple things, namely, who would you say, Henry, is the predominant core of people who identify as evangelical?
Well, this is exactly what's changing. I'm not a sociologist. I don't have, data or whatever to back this up, but I have a sort of suspicion that as the term evangelical is more and more correlated with Trump's base. I mean, we can even see this with the National Review and J.D. Vance and these people making these articles about how sort of white trash yokels deserve to die, right? These sort of infamous articles that have come out. And I think about how the sort of smart evangelicals, the ones that are, have the book learning, they tend, at least over my lifetime, to take on this like confessional label. So they go from being evangelical to being, I'm Dutch Reformed or I'm, Presbyterian or whatever. Mm. And there's a kind of on-ramp to something that's maybe has a different kind of respectability. And so the kind of conflicting notions of respectability or alignment or who is us, who are we, who do I want to identify myself with, right? Like let's just be honest. I mean, Mason, you work at a seminary. If people are, open Trumpers at your seminary, I assume they would have social problems.
They're not going to get along too well.
You know what I mean? So like, is James K.A. Smith, is he an evangelical or not? Right? Because you're familiar with James Smith, I assume. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you can work at Calvin College and you can have certain conservative theological beliefs, but you're not associated with, the guy that said, Lion Ted and all this stuff, right?
Right.
Am I just reading too much politics? Is it not that political? Have I gone too far here with this thesis?
I think there's an interesting sociological dimension to this question, but I also think this is something that a friend of mine mentioned to me a few months ago. And I don't know if it's too naive, if it's too simplistic of an understanding, which is for generations, we were telling people, especially since the 70s, we were telling people the core of Jesus' message is love, acceptance, neighborliness, community service, caring for your neighbor. And these are the same people who had, I should say, who both have and had exclusionary and discriminatory political beliefs. So I think what's happening is that the children of these boomers, the children of the Gen Xers, are coming up to age at a point where they're seeing the dissonance between the charismatic proclamation of their churches and the behavior of their parents. Maybe this is too simple of an analysis to make, but I think when I talk to what are they called, the Zoomers, Gen Z people, a lot of them who've left the church, the refrain that I hear over and over again is that the behavior of their parents and grandparents does not or did not match the proclamation that they were hearing in their churches. And I think once you have that distinction operative in mind, we can then start to think about more discrete sociological categories about what percentage really are the churches that are having American flags inside of them, are having, rock concerts where Donald Trump is praised. Is that a massive percentage of evangelicalism, or is it a minority of the evangelical population? Is it just that there seems to be a profound rupture between behavior and what is preached?
Mm-hmm. There's a super famous, potentially the most famous, ex-evangelical person out there. His name is Rhett McLaughlin. He has a show on YouTube called Rhett and Link, the Good Mythical Morning. And he has a podcast where he kind of talks about all these different things. And he said something along the lines was the problem for those of us who left evangelicalism is that our parents taught us about Jesus. And so I think you're really on the nose there, Keanu, about that there are a lot of people who are recognizing that there is a dissonance with what they were taught at church versus what the church was actually doing. And that has led them to, again, either move to a different kind of Christianity or leave Christianity altogether. I do think it's in the millions. I don't think that this is a niche thing that's just happening on social media. I do think there are a lot of people who experience this very thing, and there is just a lot of not only publications about it right now, but there's just a lot of visibility of people who are very out front about, hey, I was taught this thing at church and my church ended up supporting Donald Trump. So there are just millions and millions of people. So I think it could be pretty seismic. I really do think that this could, even though I disagree with the whole marketing and everything of all of this, I do think this could be a really seismic shift that happens in American Christianity. I do think hundreds of years from now, we would look back and say, hey, this Donald Trump thing created something with evangelicalism that really fractured it in a way that it would never be able to be the same.
I mean, I personally think a lot of the details of the Great Awakening thesis are totally specious, but I think it's just obvious if anybody's been paying attention to American life that, we had hundreds of thousands of people that were completely apolitical come out during the George Floyd rebellion of all races, many white who probably had no particular relationship to the violence of the state or anything going on, right? So obviously something is afoot. I mean, obviously the center cannot hold forever. We can't just maintain things as they were indefinitely. And I've noticed even among my evangelical family that there's been a great change in rhetoric and disposition on a whole number of issues. Now, maybe they haven't changed all their basic theology, but it's not like they're just, stuck in the past, completely unwilling to grow or to reconsider or to change an approach. I have this I'm of two minds of it, because I think it's absolutely true what you're saying, Keanu, about this charismatic aspect and the kind of dissonance between the reality and the preaching. But also I just think it's obvious that evangelicalism is low status. And there's this explicit political element where even you see the independent fundamentalist Baptist, wiping the spittle and talking about women's clothing. He's not ignorant. He's doing that intentionally. He's doing the Rush Limbaugh thing, right? And I think it's true on both sides. I don't want to say that politics is a religion and kind of make it cliche, but I think there is something about the culture war framing completely permeating all of American life in a sort of inescapable way. And I don't know how to pull these pieces apart. Maybe they can't be pulled apart. Maybe that's fine. We'll leave them all together. But as I think about the deconstruction, part of me wants to say, for example, and maybe Mason and Keanu, you should both respond to this. I know that Mason has said that the deconstruction usually has two main questions, one about hell and one about sexuality. And everybody that's deconstructed has confronted these two questions. Am I basically summarizing you correctly, Mason?
I think those are two really prominent ones, especially around sexuality. I mean, that's such a huge question in an evangelical church right now.
And why do you think these two questions? I mean, for me, it seems obvious that like Obergefell, the changing of the law so that now homosexuality, gay marriages, etc., are legal means that this is an inevitable thing. Mm-hmm. I'm interested in both your takes on why these two questions, or maybe Keanu, you disagree and there's more questions, whatever. Yeah, Mason, do you think it's just a political, like it's a result of the changing climate, or is there something theological per se about the question? Like what makes these two relevant?
Well, I do think like theologically and politically, it's all very much connected. Theologically, their claim would be that if we're going to move on sexuality, the entire thing of how we understand the Bible and our entire faith is going to have to shift. Which here's the thing is like somebody who like left that world, like it kind of is true. Like everything else shifted when I started to question how evangelicals thought about sexuality. But the thing is it's deeper than just theology too. There's a political aspect to it too, where if evangelicalism moves on sexuality, not only are they re-questioning their entire faith, but it will then start to question the power that they have, especially when it comes to American political life. Evangelicals are far overrepresented especially in the federal government, and that just like little movements like that around sexuality will completely change that, where they'll lose a lot of support. And they'll lose a lot of that power. And so I do think both are happening at the same time. Theologically, they're very concerned, but I think a lot of it is due to the fact that they're really concerned about their power, their political power.
No, I agree with Mason wholeheartedly. I think there really is a sense where we have like you mentioned, overrepresented evangelicals grasping onto political power. And I think a lot of it is opportunistic, for sure. But part of it seems to be the beginnings of a fracture in an otherwise coherent worldview, where you think about the German word Weltanschauung, right? The way in which the cosmos of a person is perceived. When you begin to break apart the very foundations of what it means to be a white, straight American man, and you start to introduce otherness, you start to introduce categories of difference as not being deviations from the norm, but to there being ontologies of difference in the very characterization of your universe, you begin to shift away from the moorings of identity, and you begin to see these disjunctions in time, in space, in family, in sexuality. Derrida often said that. Well, I know at least at one point he said that the point of deconstruction is to question the form of the nation state. He has an essay on race where he talks about the South African question, right? He talks about how the European states in America were pointing their finger at South Africa and saying, "Oh, you horrible people doing this apartheid! It's because you're part of this dysfunctional African system." No, apartheid is a result of European colonialism, right? And so once we kind of pull back the covers, the point of deconstruction is to say, what are these binaries, whether they're about heaven or hell, about straight or gay, or about being a white man in a world that's being rapidly transformed by immigration, by new forms of identification. So yeah, that's how I'd sum up the whole thing. That it's about questioning binaries. Um, I do have one worry though with this framing, which is, what is the experience of the average person who is going about doing something that we're going to call abstractly deconstruction? Because I think a lot of it involves this great shift, right? And you said, Henry, that you find it specious, the great awakening, so to speak. I'm curious to know why you said that, and how do you square that with this what we perceive to be a real meaningful sociological transformation?
Yeah, I mean, I said it was specious because typically the argument about the Great Awakening is that there's this wokeness and it's a religion and it's a substitute for, I don't know, traditional religion. And there's this whole discourse attached to it that I don't want to per se endorse. I think the way I would kind of think about it briefly is that, you brought up the question of worldview, and you brought up these categories of white, straight, blah, 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 these sort of intersectional categories. And what we can see, if we just look at it a little bit, if we take a step back and look at it from a sociological perspective, that there are many forms of evangelicalism that are comfortable with certain questions. It's not that they're all radical fundamentalists that accept no question, right? The confessional Protestants, for example, are happy. The 1689 London Baptist Confession, Reformed Baptists, will normally acknowledge Presbyterians as, good Christians, even if they disagree about when baptism can occur. Various
So nice
evangelical, sometimes they'll accept it, right? You'll have evangelicals debating about eschatology within a certain framework, right? Dispensationalism or not dispensationalism, pre, post, amillennial, et cetera, et cetera.
Calvinism versus Arminianism. I remember that being like the one and only debate I was able to have in
that's one debate, but that's a debate that they can that the terms and the worldview around it are such that it's acceptable.
Right.
And I think we see this even today with the kind of meltdown of the old structures where, like, Anthony Bradley got into some Twitter discourse yesterday talking about basically his defense of Dave Ramsey and landlording and, raising rents on people because, a lot of people were following him because he had been critiquing the sort of racial stances of evangelicals. And there is a sense in which some evangelicals can debate race, but they can't debate the property relation, right? There's certain, there's overlapping different zones. And I think, and again, I can't purport to have a great theory of this. I wonder if deconstruction is not simply the name for this experience of evangelicalism in general becoming untenable. But I think there's something about the collapse of the coherence of the worldview where, like I was talking about earlier, I'm talking to guys that are telling me, when I was 10, they said if you bore to the center of the earth, you'd fall into hell. Like, I don't know how you're supposed to maintain a belief in this stuff, like young earth creationism and all these things, if that's what you're being told. You brought up Rhett and Link Mason. I listened to Link's YouTube video about this, and he went on and on about like drinking alcohol when he was in high school. Do you know what I mean? Like, if you're told drinking alcohol, smoking cigarettes, playing cards, going to the movies, whatever, is all of the devil, how are you supposed to sustain that? Mm-hmm. How are you supposed to even care about the Nicene Creed when, like, you get drunk one time in high school and now you're damned for eternity or whatever? Mm-hmm. I just feel like it's untenable. I basically think that for different reasons, a lot of evangelicals back themselves into corners, and now they're screwed because they can't. If you're a young earth creationist, how do you come out of that? You know what I mean? Like, what do you do? You can just double down. You just have to keep doubling down, and you end up like Ray Comfort. You know what I mean? You just end up in a totally subcultural milieu where you're incomprehensible to the world around you. Am I wrong? Am I being too generous?
It's also why you would see someone like a young earth creationist easily become an anti-vaxxer. Like the jump there is not much at all.
Yeah, because you're like, and I think that's also why there's the cross-pollination between those things. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like the flat earth, anti-vax, young earth people, like they're all in the same, they're all in the corner.
Right.
And how are they supposed to come out of the corner? Like, how can you confront, evolution, sexuality, the scriptures, everything at once. And I feel like for a lot of people, you get into that corner, Keanu, and it's like the easy, like deconstruction is just like walking out the side door. Does that make sense? Like maybe I'm going to do witchcraft now. Like everything's on the table, basically. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think you're tapping into something that I think is on point. But I think perhaps we might be overstating the case just a little bit. What I mean by that is perhaps this is my coastal elitism coming into play here. But I do wonder how deeply people are thinking about these questions. This is my reading of Talal Asad, Sabah Mahmood, and Clifford Geertz. Namely, the cultural life world that these people are finding themselves in is not necessarily like I mentioned earlier, I was trying to grasp at this. Really, what percentage of these people are independent fundamentalist Baptists, right? I don't think it's a big percentage of this population, right? Most of them are filling out the roles of what some sociologists might call being a quote unquote normal American, average American, right? Granted, that's an arbitrary, abstraction that's changing as time and geography and immigration statistics change. But once you start asking this question of like, what are these people thinking about on their day-to-day basis? What is consuming their thought? And I don't necessarily think that most of these people are thinking about theological questions unless they're directly affected by the points Mason brought up, which is namely, if let's say your grandparent passed away and they were not a Christian, or let's say you identify as gay and you're in the conservative evangelical movement, or let's say your brother or sister is gay. I think at some point there is a domino effect where enough people start questioning these binary oppositions. Their conversations start happening at enough of a scale, and I think this is a consequence of this efflorescence, if you will, of deconstruction is coming out of that, coming out of these broader multiplying factors of conversations. But again, I think my view might be too naive. I think the political factor that Henry brought up might be more on point. You might have to think about what exactly is the role of Donald Trump in fragmenting the evangelical movement into a particular demographic block. Like maybe that is more important.
I don't even think it's necessarily him. Like he might contribute to it, but I think it's more that this normal American you evoked doesn't exist and hasn't existed for a long time. The sort of mass politics, the mass society, the mass identity of America has been my entire life falling apart. And now it's falling apart in a very explicit way, where people are going to work and they're getting anti-racism trainings and they're going on social media and people are ranting to them about their white privilege, and they're going to church and people at church are talking about, we were involved in slavery or whatever. Right. And I think it's just the assumptions in general have been called into question. And so once the assumptions are called into question, if it's been given to you as like a unit, like I gave Mason his evangelicalism as a block, and it's all being chiseled at, how long can the block really remain intact? Like, okay, now I'm going to hold on to Tulip, but I'm going to be woke also. Like, it just doesn't, do you know what I mean? It doesn't really cohere anymore. Am I wrong, Mason?
No, I think there certainly is a level to that. And I also have wondered, talking about kind of this like normal American, and I think you're right that there hasn't been this normal American, or it certainly is being chiseled away. I will say, I think out of the millions of people right now who are leaving evangelicalism, maybe it's because of the right wing and evangelical marriage or whatever it might be, most are not like identifying with this label around like deconstruction. I mean, this is like, even though I think there are a lot of people, they're not all like, I'm all in on like this deconstruction thing. I've talked to a lot of people who grew up in evangelicalism, and some of whom would have no idea who Pete Rollins is, no idea who Rob Bell is, no idea any of these, all these like big people that we see on Twitter and TikTok, and have no idea any of those people. It's because they like just kind of, like you had that analogy, they just sort of like slipped through the back door and didn't even interrogate any of these beliefs. But then there are some people who grew up in evangelicalism, came to this moment of realization that, hey, I'm gay. And that's when they had to like actually interrogate their beliefs around this. And that's when they actually have to confront all these other things around, whether it might be heaven and hell and whatnot. So that's like the other thing to keep in mind too, is it's not like every single person who's leaving evangelicalism is like gathering around this like market of deconstruction. It really seems to me be the people who are like most affected by this. So they have a lot of like emotional trauma and therefore have a lot of emotional investment around deconstruction, which is why you see a lot of people get really, really emotionally just kind of on edge when you talk about it on social media. So that's something I think that's like worthwhile to think about too, is that there are lots of different kinds of people who may have really similar experiences with leaving evangelicalism, but they aren't all like around this idea of deconstruction.
Maybe should we, rather than think of deconstruction as a term to be applied to individuals, should we just say that deconstruction is like an objective historical process that is ongoing within American evangelicalism? Like, objectively speaking, it is being taken apart. Is that too Hegelian, Keanu? Would you roll with that?
As an objective historical process, I think that's a little bit of a stretch for me. I would say that if I were to combine my my more I'll call it more my more naive narrative with your perhaps more political sociological analysis, I think we have to admit that something is happening in the state of affairs. There's something rotten in the state of Denmark right now, where we think about what's going on in evangelical publishing conferences. I think we're at what Stuart Hall calls a conjectural point right now. The pandemic, the election, the crumbling of the world order that Francis Fukuyama talked about at the turn of the century, the rise of authoritarian movements across the world. We're seeing profound changes geopolitically, geostrategically. We're seeing profound changes sociologically. I think all of these amount to a situation that, like you said, Henry, evangelicals are finding themselves to hold an untenable set of belief structures that are not fungible with the set of circumstances the world finds itself in at the present moment. How do you maintain these subcultures in an endless assault of the world against them? How do you maintain these positions? And so I see it as a sinking ship. Mm-hmm. But it's a sinking ship that is transforming itself at the same time. It's rebranding every day, trying to stay afloat.
Mm-hmm. I mean, let's take a couple of things in particular. Mason has a reputation for pissing people off intentionally. Is that fair to say?
Sir, I will honestly say never intentionally. Never
intentionally. You never tweet out anything in order to get a rise out of people.
No, honestly, I do not. Now, I understand why some people do
we'll
get
cut
upset,
it. Cutting it from the show. We'll just cut that from the recording.
But not intentionally.
So there are people that get very angry at you, Mason. And I'm shocked to see people talking about Russell Moore the way they talk about you. Or Al Mohler. Right? Like, if you think Al Mohler is a lib, where are you standing?
Right.
And I feel like there's this fundamental decoherence going on to where evangelicalism isn't some eternal tradition that's, gone on forever and ever. It's relatively recent as a phenomenon. And I think its shelf life might be coming to an end, basically that it's expiring before our eyes. I mean, we see Beth Moore has joined Keanu as a high church Anglican, right? Like, what's going on here? I never thought in my life that I would be an Orthodox Christian. Like, everything is up for grabs. Mm-hmm. So am I projecting? Is this like my own desire to see evangelicalism end? Or do you think this is something real?
Well, I think it's important to understand, like, evangelicalism emerged out of the colonial context, right? And so because so much of the thought that was the framework around evangelicalism was colonialism. As we are starting to see more obviously postmodern thought and post-colonial thought emerge and become a dominant fixture within all of the world, I think that's going to start to undermine different institutions like evangelicalism that emerged out of colonialism. I don't know, I could be wrong, but that seems to be something where, because it emerged out of colonialism and because there's such a strong critique right now worldwide of colonial thought, it seems to make sense that something like evangelicalism would also start to be chipped away at and be highly critiqued and potentially go away.
It's not even that all the evangelicals are going to become Anglican. It's just that they might all rebrand themselves as non-denominational. They drop the name, drop the label. That the label literally might take on a purely political valence of some kind. Like it'll be like the Guelph and the Ghibelline. In 500 years, people will be studying this and be like, what is this word evangelical? It's been used in so many different ways, over the centuries. I don't know what you all have to make of it, because I think that both of you, being in America more recently than me, you have some kind of sense for what's going on the ground. And I have, for example, you brought up this idea that there are people that are actively deconstructing versus just leaving. Like I know people that have just left because, they got married to the worship pastor when they were 19, and then their marriage sucked and they got a divorce, and then it's over. And then it's just weird to go back to the church because that's where they got married and divorced and all these things. And so they just walk away because that's religion. You know what I mean? That's what their religion is. And if you're told that's what religion is and it fails, then you're just out. Is that deconstruction? Is people walking away? Are we going to call that deconstruction or not? Is that a different thing? Is that the same thing?
At least from what I've seen and what people and how people use deconstruction, it does seem to be different.
It is different.
At least from my perspective and how I've seen people use that term, that it's not just simply leaving a religion altogether. There is some sort of active process.
There has to be an activity.
It does seem to be that way.
Do people, for those of us who aren't deconstructing but are maybe sympathetic, is there something we can do to help them? Like, how can we help people that are coming out of this, for example? Do they need help? Do they got it? Should we just leave them to their own devices?
I mean, at least from my perspective, and again, it's because a lot of the people that seem to care about the things I'm up to might be one of those people that does actively identify with deconstruction and are maybe going through that activity. From my perspective, it's always been, I do trust that people who have significant trauma will know what to do with, or maybe have a decent sense of what to do with that trauma, or at least that somebody doesn't have to undo their trauma for them.
Sure.
And so,
but do you proselytize, for example?
Proselytize Christianity?
Like you have this progressive position that is kind of unique, with both the liberation and the process.
Right.
That is a cocktail that is pretty foreign from, I think, what most Reformed Baptists would be familiar with.
So in that regard, people who have actively gone through, again, quote unquote, deconstruction, for those who are interested in still remaining a person of faith and not just leaving religion altogether, I'm really interested in what are ways that we can think about God? What are ways that we can think about church? What are ways that we can think about ethics, particularly from a Christian framework that potentially they might be interested in? They were brought up with a certain idea of God that they want to do away with, but they're still interested in the question of God, and maybe process theology could be an alternative for them, right? So those are the reasons why I'm interested in the work that I'm doing that I think could be really helpful. Now, that's not to say that a person who's deconstructing needs help with only process theology. Clearly lots of people can become Anglican and even become have a much more reform conception of God, right? But what I'm interested in doing is simply offering alternatives that do seem to be beneficial. But that's not to say that the particular theologies that I'm interested in are the only ways that people who are going through deconstruction will be benefited by.
I think the approach I would take is Socratic in nature. What I mean by that is you have to meet the person where they're at, and you have to ask them, what exactly is it that they have a problem with? I think more often than not, what I found is people do not really have intellectual problems with Christianity. More often than not, it is psychological and spiritual problems with Christianity. Namely, being told that God's gospel is a gospel of grace, yet hearing nothing but legalism behind that. It's this cognitive dissonance of being emotionally tortured. The best example I have is I'm not a fan of John Piper. I'll just put it on the table. I think his whole desiring
Wow, that
God.
was a safe thing for you to say.
His whole Desiring God book about Christian hedonism is an example of a term that I perhaps want to do more research about. I call it emotional terrorism. Basically, the idea that a certain affective disposition is required to be a Christian, I think, is a very silly idea. And most people I talk to who come out of that are people who have depression, people who have a major depressive disorder, people who have seasonal affective disorder, who don't feel the joy and contentment and happiness that Christianity provides. And they're being told that they're bad Christians because they're not happy. And I think that ultimately what it comes down to for me is asking, is your problem that you do not believe God can exist? Is your problem that you believe God is allegedly loving and all good, yet he eternally, what is the term? Eternal conscious torments people with a pitchfork because they made a bad decision. Like, what is the problem that we're encountering here? I think the most people will have concrete answers to that question. What is it that they're facing that is a blockage to their spirituality? And more often than not, people need time to recover from spiritual abuse and from trauma. People need to be left to develop emotional resources and emotional strength to recover from toxicity and toxic Christianity. And I think that for those whom intellectual problems do pose major obstacles, there's no shortage of resources to be found about proving, evidentiary truths about the reliability of the New Testament documents, the reliability of the Old Testament documents in terms of their provenance, right? But at the end of
all
the
the
day,
answers are at the Anglican Church, right?
The Anglican Church provides the solutions to every question and
Every
problem.
one of them.
It's every one of them. It provides specifically the Episcopal Church. The American Episcopal Church is the.
That's right. That's right. Not the ACNA shit.
Not the ACNA shit. Absolutely not.
I don't know. You might need to get in touch with Beth, Keanu.
Yeah, I'll have to convert. She'll have to have an authentic religious experience and convert to the true form of Episcopalian.
She's gonna have to deconstruct from ACNA.
But I mean, that does really put a fine point on it, though, because we see people doing a move that is like objectively, if we just look at theological categories, like a piece of paper, a big chart, going from SBC to ACNA is not that insane.
Right.
It's not that big of a difference. I mean, there's a difference. I'm not saying there's nothing. It's just, it's not that crazy. But the amount of hell this woman caught for this move is insane. Or the whole Jesus and John Wayne book. I haven't even finished this book. But the claims in this book are not that crazy. You know what I mean? Like, this is not the leotard stuff that you were referring to earlier, Mason, of like the emergent guys reading. Like, this is
right.
Relatively standard, sociological study of different things. I don't see why people have to go. But I think there is something really traumatic. And I kind of shy away from that language because I think it's so overused. But I do wonder if America itself is not this kind of traumatizing, just giant like Abu Ghraib of the human soul. Yeah. Where we just, I mean, even if you were like a relatively well-off, I remember when I was growing up, there was a kid in my Christian school, and the Christian school was not like in the ghetto or any kind of violent area. But I remember a woman, her whole family, a girl at the school, I guess at the time, multiple people, like her mother and her two brothers, were all assassinated just randomly in the suburbs. Just like a guy showed up and robbed their house. They were in there. They were all just shot down. They were all just laid down. And this aspect of American life where you can just Your school could be shot up. Anything could be shot up. Anything could be blown up. Death could just come at any moment. That's one specific detail. But I think there is this kind of anxiety or tension or like this fear of like losing your house at any time. Like the market could crash and you could lose everything, even if you're comfortable. You're not free from this precarity that's just undergirding the whole thing. And I really wonder to what a degree because in Europe it's not like that. Like if I go to work tomorrow and I get hit by a bus, my family's fine. Like nothing, it would be sad, but like they're not going to lose the house. They're not going to lose their medical insurance because I'm no longer employed. You know what I mean? Like it's not that stressful. I don't know. Do you all feel like it's been a stressful time in America? Is there this general stress playing a part into this trauma? Or is it specifically that, people were taught that they're going to hell forever? We didn't even really talk about hell. Mason, do you believe in hell?
Me? No.
Not at all.
No, I mean not as like not as like some sort of metaphysical reality.
So you don't believe in hell in any sense? Eschatologically speaking.
Yeah, certainly not.
Like it's some kind of poet, or you speak for yourself. I'm sorry.
I really don't know how to describe it other than like it really just does not like play much a part into my own theology. Eschatologically is like some sort of metaphysical reality. I don't really have any way to think about it. I really actually don't have much of a eschatology, which is probably a weakness of my theology. And it's probably just a weakness of process in general. But I do think that like just the general stress of American life may have some piece to this. I mean, I know a lot of people who, again, grew up in evangelicalism, have been ostracized and estranged by their family. And because of that, like the financial kind of burden that places on somebody, I mean, like that was certainly a possibility for me as I was going through college and starting to change my beliefs and everything. I was legitimately afraid that my parents wouldn't be able to support me through college, to loan me money anymore. That like I thought I would have to drop out. I mean, and that's just like a very like just a microcosm of the kind of issues that a lot of other people do experience as they become estranged and ostracized from their financial and communal support. When you start to lose your church community because you don't believe this or that or whatever, to lose that kind of community that you at least knew that they had your back at all times. I mean, that's a really scary thing. And especially when you, all of that is exacerbated by just American life and that there's just no social net for, there's no risk that can be taken. So I do think that just like the general American structure of society is just like not conducive at all for someone to be able to go through this process without some level of stress and trauma and all of those different things.
Do you think that also drives the deconstruction in the reverse? That like if you're a popular YouTuber and you get to like, I don't know, 5 million subscribers and you want to get to the next 50 million, that being a conservative evangelical might not get you there, given the social changes in America?
I don't think we're there yet. That could be a thing though, honestly. I think it's still like if somebody was really just in it for the money, it's more appropriate to become a megachurch pastor. I think that's an easier route for most people right now.
What do you think, Keanu?
But that could change though. I do think that could change.
Mm-hmm.
I think this circles back to what we spoke about earlier about my cynicism regarding deconstruction as a kind of avenue for market capitalization. I think it seems to me that it's sort of like the whole Hillary Clinton aesthetic, appealing to the most amount of people with the most generic possible, appellation, so to speak. That
I'm with her.
I'm with.
Like
I mean, you go from I'm for eternal conscious
torment. Who's the
torment.
Tim Kaine of deconstruction? That's my real question.
Did you all see him getting lost on that highway thing?
Yeah.
That's what I mean about like America just being stressful. You can just get stranded. Like you're literally, it's like one of the wealthiest, most powerful parts of the country, and they can't maintain the highway.
And you're a former vice presidential candidate, and you're just stuck on your own damn highway.
I'm sorry, Keanu. Please go on. You were talking about Hillary Clinton and the generic appeal.
Yeah, just that it seems to me that you move from. It's kind of like Barack Obama changing his position on gay marriage. Like you move towards what is the most popular sentiment, and what is the most popular sentiment in the United States right now. I think one of the arguments I made in a tweet, maybe I don't know how many months ago, was that it seems to me that Americans have lost. They find basic Augustinian claims to be unsavory. And what I mean by that is, do you recall the whole critical race theory conversation where this white mother was very enraged that her child was being taught that she's quote unquote evil because she's white? Like, Americans no longer have the capacity to think in terms of generational sin or in terms of the category of national responsibility. Like,
I actually saw that from one of these deconstruction people on YouTube. They were going on about how, well, Christianity tells me I'm broken, but I'm not broken. Don't tell me I'm broken.
That's so funny, which is really interesting to me. This is really interesting claim that I think, especially if you bring in the topic of people who are doing deconstruction. Now, I'm not sitting here trying to articulate a defense for Augustinian Christianity. Sure. But what I am saying is that I do think it's interesting that we no longer have the capacity to think about things collectively. That the notion of a national responsibility for a crime or a set of crimes is no longer a tenable position to hold.
What do you think about this, Mason? Do you think that there's anything about this just fundamental change in perspective? That maybe the power of positive thinking has kind of overtaken the gospel completely. So when you tell somebody like, you need Jesus, like, don't tell me what I need. You know what I mean?
I mean, I think it does align closely with the fact that just in general, Americans are becoming less religious, although if you survey, I mean, a lot of surveys indicate that while Americans are participating in religious institutions less, their sense of like spirituality or their practice of spirituality is still at the, if not even increasing. And so, like, you get this like category of like spiritual but not religious. Like, that's a legitimate category that really is like becoming a that's playing a really massive factor. And I don't think it's disconnected that you can have somebody call themselves a deconstruction coach and make a living out of that when you also have this rise of not only people leaving evangelicalism, but you also have this like rise of like positive thinking, spiritual but not religious category. Like, there is certainly like a market for it that is becoming much more prominent than it was 20, 25 years ago. And I think all of that's sort of like connected as to why you're seeing more and more people almost like take a clergy status within like deconstruction and like the spiritual but not religious movement. Like, it's really interesting.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting how certain of these assumptions, like we talked about at the beginning, don't really get challenged. Like when we have all these self-proclaimed witches and they form this big national coven, what's the thing they try to do? They try to hex Allah to punish the Taliban, right? They like maintain U.S. foreign policy objectives, but instead of summoning the spirits of Africa or the angels of Africa to keep Donald Trump in power, they try to use their dark magic to hex Allah. And I think there's something telling about this kind of, it's the sort of, you were talking earlier about this colonial aspect of evangelicalism. And I think materially speaking, that cannot be underestimated. The fact that there's literally this frontier colonies. So you can't have your fancy Episcopal seminaries going out and training people. Like, you have to send circuit riders, you have to have a total logistic system of preaching. And this is fertile ground for the development of evangelicalism as we know it. That's why you can have these revivals, these awakenings, etc.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that could occur in like 19th century or 18th century, Italy, for example. I just don't think it's like the same kind of a situation.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're in such a different situation that maybe what we're seeing isn't the death of evangelicalism, but kind of an evolution. Like, Beth Moore is not the only Southern Baptist who is exploring high church traditions like the Anglican thing. Do we say that Beth Moore deconstructed? Maybe we should. What drives somebody like that to move in a direction that, when I think Mason is probably a little bit older than I am, but like in the 2000s, nobody ever talked about, like, liturgy was like something that Shane Claiborne talked about and Brian McLaren. They would like put candles in the house church or something.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like, where does this whole liturgy thing come from?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was like a level of that with like the emergent movement. It was kind of this like conglomeration of all these different traditions, from like Pentecostalism to Orthodoxy to Catholicism to the Wesleyan tradition. Like, it's just like all of like these different aspects of Christian traditions, and kind of like picking and choosing and putting them all together into one liturgy. And so I think that's like where you start to see some of that. But that I still think is like different than someone like Beth Moore being basically casted out of the Southern Baptist Convention and becoming Anglican. I mean, maybe she has like some reason for why she's like interested in like high church liturgy or whatever. But it also might be something where, and this is total speculation, but it also might be something where that just was like a compromise that she made. Like, instead of singing Hillsong songs, now she's just like going to have to sing Great Is Thy Faithfulness and smell some candles. Like,
I'm going to try to get Beth Moore
like,
on the podcast to talk about it.
Do it. I'd love to hear what she has to say. That would be a big get. She's hilarious, by the way. I'm not a big fan of her, but she is funny.
No, I think I have no beef with Beth whatsoever. And I think, honestly, there's a lot of people in her situation that have been catching hell for no reason. Like I mentioned, Catherine de Metz is like some kind of Reformed church, Dutch Reform, whatever. Like, there's no reason for her to be catching hell perpetually from people for writing a book.
Right.
And I wonder about this liturgy thing because it's so foreign to the evangelical, like, pocketbook, or not pocketbook, that's putting it too crassly, but like the big rock show productions. These are huge. These are central. These are getting, filling huge churches. So in that context where that's like success, where success is measured by reaching people, I feel like the liturgy is the total opposite direction.
Mm-hmm.
And why is this part of the question? Like, why? I don't know. I'm sorry, I don't really have like a good fleshed out thing. It just seems to be kind of a telling contradiction, a kind of symptom of something, some development.
Yeah, I'm probably not the best to ask that because like I actually had the opposite reaction when I first encountered more high church liturgical traditions. From conservative evangelicalism. I just was like, I mean, I certainly did not like the big worshipy aspect of conservative evangelicalism. I did not like that. But I also, like, when I first encountered like the Episcopal Church and stuff, theologically, I was like, hey, this is interesting. But liturgy wise, I was like, this is not for me at all, which is part of the reason why I went into that like more emergent church space, because it felt like something different than that. But you have someone like Rachel Held Evans, rest in peace. She was a obviously conservative evangelical person and then did become Episcopal. And she wrote almost like one of her books was all about how like she was really drawn to the liturgical aspect of the Episcopal Church. So there certainly is like a number of those people that like Beth Moore that are really interested in that aspect because it does feel so opposite to the evangelical way of doing worship. But at least for me, like, I'm not the best to ask that because like I was just like, I'm just not interested in a lot of high church liturgy stuff. That's where like my Pentecostalism that I grew up in has like, it's kind of deep in my bones.
What do you make of this, Keanu? I know we've been rambling on. We don't have to continue forever, but I'm just kind of interested in thinking through this with you all because you both have such different perspectives from me.
I suppose for me, the liturgical aspect was very important. I moved from Reformed Baptist to Presbyterian PCA to the Roman Catholic Church, and now I'm in TEC in the Episcopal Church. And I think that trajectory shows a fondness for high church liturgy, but at the same time, a desire for a theology that could accommodate the suffering and trauma of LGBTQ people, and a respect for the priestlyhood of women. And I think that those two issues for me were actually more important than the heaven or hell issue. Because even as a PCA Calvinist, I wasn't entirely sold on double predestination as a concept that is indexed to individuals. I've always had a kind of Bartian streak in me where I realized that God's love applies to everyone in the same way. And so for me, when I thought about doing when the term deconstruction was something that I actually grappled with, was the year after my pastoral internship, where I became a Catholic instead of becoming an atheist. I went into the Catholic Church for about 2 years, and the Catholic to Episcopal transformation, I wouldn't say was one that I would say is deconstruction. It was more of a kind of theological sifting. But I really did experience a moment of, what do I actually believe? What do I actually know to be true about God as a person? What do I know to be true about what the message of the gospel is? And so that moment for me was one where I began to question sola scriptura. I began to question the 5 tenets of the Protestant Reformation.
Wait, so you were doing this questioning from Catholic to Protestant?
From Protestant to Catholic.
Oh, excuse me. Okay.
I began to see that some of the claims that the Protestant Reformation made couldn't be held anymore in light of the most current scholarship on the new perspective on Paul within Judaism, and about the apocalyptic turn in Paul studies, that we really can't say that Luther's preoccupation about the legal forensic justification of a sinner is the most important aspect of Paul's thought. And for me, that realization that participating in the life of God was more important for Paul than some kind of question about debt forgiveness. That transformation was pretty essential for me.
Sounds like you're qualified to be a deconstruction coach.
Oh,
those are the only qualifications you need, Keanu.
See, Mason was just denying he was a troll, and now we see the truth.
That one was intentional. That
was intentional. No, it's interesting that you say this. So, Keanu, yours really was very intellectual. Your questions were very theological. And for Mason, if I remember, you were saying that it was mostly an experiential thing for you. Like you just found yourself unable to hold, like, sexuality, for example, just couldn't match your lived experience? Or what would you say drove your movements?
The catalyst was sexuality. The purity culture just was not making sense to me anymore. But I did then, that set the domino effect for questions around heaven and hell. So I remember having intense studies around that. Questions around questions around Paul and Paul's authority.
And why positively the emergent? What brought you because Keanu was talking positively and negatively.
Yeah.
And for you, what was the positive draw for the emergent situation?
First off, that I was allowed to even explore those questions was a big deal. I was not going to be able to explore that in evangelicalism, which is part of the reason why I left that world. But also the constructive theologies that were kind of coming out of that, of okay, you don't believe in heaven and hell, but here's what you ought to believe about eschatology or whatever. Those things really drew me to what a lot of emergent church leaders were talking about with those different things.
And with
I've
UCC,
since moved away from a lot of what their thought was,
Yeah.
but initially I was really drawn to the constructive aspects to it.
Because with UCC, that's Reconstructionist, right? Or Restorationist, excuse me. I'm not really familiar, so I'm not really. I don't really understand where to place the UCC.
I know that it started out in the Reformed tradition, and then it has like since moved. There was some sort of like merging.
So it's kind of mainline low church.
Yeah, it's like mainline low church. The like closest I would say that it maybe looks like. God, what would be like a good analogy
like Methodist?
to it? Maybe, but like some Methodists actually are even more high church than the UCC is.
I understand. Okay, so it's a very low church.
Yeah, but like in a very like old way. Like they're not
Do you have
like
pianos or guitars.
Yeah, it's not very usually guitar driven. Like they normally would have like organs and stuff, but
I see.
But they're not having like they're not writing like Book of Common Prayers. I can assure you that.
So they have a hymnal, but they don't have Bethel.
Correct.
No Bethel music.
But even that was like way more high church than I grew up in. Like I grew up in multiple different settings, but one of the churches that really formed me was a rural Pentecostal church on a reservation in South Dakota, and with like maybe 30 people with cockroaches running around, stray dogs. I mean, it was like really rural, really impoverished, and that like very like Pentecostal, like exorcising demons, all of that, like in worship. That's what I was formed by. So even like the fact that they were singing hymns, I was like, I have no idea what any of these are.
I see what you mean. And so the positive draw for UCC is that it's also open enough to your questioning that you can just do your work, and it's not, nobody's giving you hell for that.
Yeah, I mean, like ecclesially, I'm not UCC. I'm not ordained in the UCC. I don't even go to a UCC church. But that's the institution that I'm a part of at the seminary I'm at. That's the institution that the seminary is a part of. But yeah, but I do appreciate kind of the openness to explore different kinds of theologies in the UCC.
And how would you explain your church situation?
It's super emergent. I mean, like
I see. So it's still emergent.
Yeah.
I see.
We have a new pastor now over the last couple of years, and she's UCC, but she like does not really bring in a lot of the UCC aspects to the church. But the church that I am a part of and used to work at was one of the poster childs of the emergent church. I mean, it was the church that if there were books written about the emergent church, that's the church that would be talked about in those books.
Very interesting. I think it's, to be honest, for me, the whole thing with orthodoxy was the spirituality aspect, which is maybe like telling from my evangelical background, but just feeling like, how am I actually supposed to do anything? Like, we have all this great theology, but how am I actually supposed to live? That was the main. A lot of the theological stuff is very interesting, and I was interested in it, from an abstract perspective. It was kind of like philosophical study or whatever, but it was just people sitting me down and being like, this is actually how you can pray and, come to grips with who you are and what you've done and the world and all these things. And I think that's something that's kind of maybe absent. We have these moments of kind of ecstatic conversion where you dedicate your life to Christ, or you cast out a demon, or you get a demon cast out of you, or, these different things happen. But sometimes I feel like there's a kind of dryness in the day-to-day. You go to church, you have the light show, you have the music, you have all this stuff, and then what do?
At least for me, when I was in conservative evangelicalism, it did feel like that. However, the day-to-day was really structured around, what is the Republican Party telling me to do day-to-day? Like, so that meant for me, like as a kid, going to Tea Party movement stuff and like reading the Constitution, and like that was the day-to-day. It was so aligned with right-wing politics and the Republican Party that really your discipleship was Christian language placed on right-wing ideology.
Was it the same for you, Keanu?
No, not at all. Like I said, I wasn't raised in a religious background.
Then
I've
when did you
never,
become a Reformed Baptist?
when I was 13.
And how did that happen?
So I had
We
a
can
very
cut
traumatic.
this. I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. I had a very traumatic health episode, and I basically was in the hospital, and I found a copy of the Bible, and I read the book of Isaiah and the book of John. And from that point, I started looking for churches. And ironically, I went to a PCUSA church and I hated it. Um, and I was like, this is terrible. And then I found this church that was close to my house, and I would go there, and I started like developing fellowship with people, and it was really wonderful. I got baptized there. My parents thought I was crazy. They sent me to see a psychiatrist. Uh, and um,
I mean, you
and
did become Reformed Baptist. I can see why they would want to send you. I'm just kidding.
Just imagine you're like nominally Shia, and you're in America. And you're like, shit. We just got out of this like fundamentalism, and your kid comes home and it's like, I'm Reformed Baptist.
So yeah, that was definitely what happened, and I kind of began to become more high church as I became a Presbyterian, and I still remember the conversation I had with the youth pastor at the Baptist church. I'm just like, how could you let the souls of these children just how could you treat your children so poorly by not baptizing them? And he was so offended. He was like, he took it very personally. And so then I got into the Presbyterian church, and then I kind of learned how the sausage was made as a pastoral intern, and I had a crisis of faith, and I was just like, how can you base the whole of your Christian life on 66 books of the Bible when it's not even the full Bible? Like, how do you know which sola scriptura to base your whole faith on? And once I read the deuterocanonical books, I was like, okay, now I need to explore Catholicism. And I fell in love with Hans Urs von Balthasar. And Balthasar brought me back to Karl Barth, which took me away from the Catholic Church again and brought me back to the Episcopal Church.
It's very interesting.
So now you're like, wow, okay. That's right. You ended up becoming Anglican. For a second, I was like, wow, you're a Catholic Bart. A Catholic Bartian. That's it.
He's still Catholic.
Yeah, I guess, yeah. Anglo-Catholic, I guess. But there, I mean, there's a lot of... Was Bart... No, Bart was Protestant, but what denomination was he a part of? What Reformed denomination?
Swiss Reformed.
Oh, okay, that would make sense. That makes sense. Okay.
Yeah, and Mason, you didn't bring this up about your story, but when you went to Emergent, how did you even find that? Like, what's the link between purity culture? So you're like disaffected with purity culture. How do you end up at like the Emergent Mecca in Minneapolis or whatever it is?
That's a great way to describe it. So when I went to college, I went to this really evangelical school in Iowa. It happened to be Dutch Reform. I didn't grow up Dutch Reform or anything, but I played football, and so they gave me a scholarship, and I could do youth ministry as a major. So I was like, those sold. So I went to this Dutch Reform school in Iowa, and and it's funny because like my mom specifically would ask the religion professors before I started, like, what's Northwestern's stance on homosexuality? Basically, like, if they were going to affirm, then like I was not going to be allowed to go there, essentially, even if that's where I wanted to go. And even if they were going to be offering me a scholarship for football, she wouldn't have let me go. So, they all kind of like, it was a Dutch Reform. In fact, the denomination that it's a part of just announced that they're going to be splitting. But it was RCA. And then because the RCA was officially like unaffirming or whatever, that's what my professors would tell them. So I just kind of went in thinking like, oh, it's going to be like conservative like me or whatever. But by that point, I was already starting to have lots of questions around, again, like around sexuality, but even like the the marriage between right-wing politics. I started like getting into like a little bit more of a libertarian bend. And that was enough for me to like, I don't know if like right-wing politics and like Christianity always have to be aligned, just because I was starting to explore libertarianism. So anyway, I went to college, and the first book we ever read was it was called Postmodern Youth Ministry. And I was like, wow, there's another Christian who like has questions about like sexuality and is still a Christian. And so I remember one day, it wasn't even a part of like the reading assignments or anything. I just like looked up the author on Google, and like in the Google related search bar, there were other people like Brian McLaren, Rob Bell, Naughty Bolts Weber, Doug Paget. So I just started like clicking on all of them and reading all of their books. And I was just like, wow, I had no idea this kind of Christianity existed. Like before that, I literally thought Joel Osteen was a liberal. Like that's the kind, like I just had no idea. Yeah, that's right. I just like legitimately had no idea that any other type of Christianity existed. And so I was just like fascinated by it. And yeah, just kind of got caught up in that whole emergent church movement, and then actually got connected with one of those people, Doug Paget, who was the pastor of Solomon's Porch at the time. And so got connected with him. And after getting to know him for about a year or two, he asked me once I graduated, if I wanted to be the youth pastor at the church. So I graduated and moved up to Minneapolis, and that's how I got stuck at Solomon's Porch.
And did the whole emerging process, do you think it's basically defunct now?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that it's a thing anymore.
So how does Solomon's Porch like continue?
So we've never been a part of a denomination, which is kind of a miracle that like we've never got funding or support from a denomination, and we're still like existing over almost 25 years at this point. Honestly, it really just comes down to like there was a lot of people who were really invested in it early on and have just kind of remained invested in it financially and obviously beyond that too. But there was just really an investment in Solomon's Porch.
So it's mostly about the people and their relationships more than the theological project.
Absolutely. I mean, there are people at Solomon's Porch who are like outright atheists. Like they, in fact, probably really don't want much to do with Christianity, but they compromise with it just because like those are their friends, and like that's a way to see their friends every week, which is really interesting. I mean, it like functions very differently than like lots of other churches. The funny thing is, like, even though they've like changed a lot theologically, they still remain a part of the church, which like growing up conservative evangelical, like if you change theologically, you're out. So it was really interesting that like people could change like very much theologically at a place like Solomon's Porch and still like felt like this is my community. This is where I'm going to invest in every month with tithes or whatever.
So if, and this might be a good place to wrap up. I don't know how much time you have. We usually record for about 2 hours. So I don't want to ask you to both to stay on here for hours and hours, but I would be interested to know about Solomon's Porch if, for example, the Nicene Creed is not what's holding it together because people don't believe in God. What do you think is there any kind of like theological formulation that would define the community, or is it completely, how do I put it? Is it based wholly in personal affinity, personal affection?
That's a really good question. Doug wrote a lot about this. Doug Paget. So sort of, I mean, we do have a formulation that we have said, and we sort of, we talk about, and it's like what, we would, if we had to put like a slogan out there, like it would be that. And we would often say it throughout our worship gatherings together. But I don't know if that like necessarily is a statement around like, this is who we are at Solomon's Porch and this is what connects us all. It really does seem like it's a relational type of thing. And so Doug would talk about, I don't know if you guys are familiar with like bounded set thinking, centered set thinking, and relational set thinking. I think that like language comes from like mathematics or something, but was incorporated in like different ways of thinking about like how you structure organizations and those different things. But Doug has like, or when Doug created Solomon's Porch, it's different now because he's not the pastor anymore. But when Doug created Solomon's Porch, he really was intentional around like, how do we create a community that's around relational set thinking? Like how is it that like this is a community that you're a part of it just because you're simply in relationship to these people? So we would have people that considered themselves a part of Solomon's Porch who never ever showed up on a Sunday, but they were a part of Solomon's Porch because they went to all the other things maybe, or whatever it might be. And Doug was really like adamant, like that's how we're going to think about our community, is that like people are, I think it worked in that like it did what it was supposed to do, that like people really did think other people were a part of the Solomon's Porch community. Now, did it work when it came to like, were we able to build like a really great sustainable church? I mean, like, yeah, Solomon's Porch might last another 5 to 10 years. I don't think it's going to be a community that's going to last forever, but I don't think that was the intention either. So if one was like, I want to build like an entire denomination of churches around this, I don't think that would work. If somebody wants to build like a community that might last 25 years, it might work in that way. So yeah, if like someone's really like interested in like creating some sort of institution, I don't think relational set thinking is like going to be particularly viable and sustainable.
Has it deconstructed itself?
Probably.
Or is the deconstruction, because I mean, this is kind of like the conservative response, is that, well, we got to deconstruct the deconstruction.
Right. There was a huge thing right before like Doug ended up moving on. So this was like 3 or 4 years ago, right around the time when I like got there. There was a lot of conversation about whether or not we want to remain an explicitly Christian community. There were a lot of people a part of the community that did not want it to remain a Christian or explicitly Christian community. And there were a lot of people who, including Doug, who is a pastor, really wanted it to remain that. And so I think that conversation was indicative of some sort of continuing deconstruction, if you will. And I don't really know
feel
where
like
that
in this conversation I feel like we deconstructed the deconstruction here in this very podcast. And I think it's something that is kind of obvious. I mean, when you look at, I mean, we've talked about the economic aspects, et cetera, et cetera. Where does this come from? I don't know, Keanu, is there any, I feel like you didn't get to talk enough about the charisma.
The minute I don't get to say the word charisma, I've already lost. It's my go-to.
Do you want to end us with some kind of charismatic proclamation?
Was it Bart that like was all about the charisma? There was some sort of like theologian was like, maybe it was Boltman or something.
It was Boltman. It was Boltman who was all about the charisma. I would just say that the radical self-disclosure of God to the world is the basis of theological reflection, and I think once we get to a point where we recognize God's love for us through his holy otherness, Henry, being made manifest to us in Jesus Christ in an explosive, cosmic, transformative way, we'll be on the path to reconciliation.